Chief Executive here at National Voices. Welcome to our weekly webinar. We do this every Friday at 11 a.m. unless it's a bank holiday, which happened last week. And we've got about 50 people joining us today, so that's a really lovely big number. And it's a very important topic, obviously, funding for the charity sector in health. Couldn't be more topical. We've got a lovely set of speakers. Georgina is with us to talk about a survey she's run in collaboration with us and ARMA about the impacts you're experiencing and reporting on your funding and from COVID. And Sarah Vibert, who is the new director, not head of policy and volunteering at NCVO. So she will talk about work they're doing on all our behalf. And we have plenty of time for discussion, and you can always in the chat download your thoughts and tell us what you think or other things we should be thinking of, or share information with other members on this call. We're doing these webinars for National Voices members, but we are trying to sort of exercise generous leadership so that other people can also join. And it's about half the people on the call today are National Voices members yet, but hopefully we'll join one day. Right, before we kick off with the substance of today, Sam is very briefly going to walk us through the technology. I'm assuming you have all used webinar technology by now, but he's just very briefly going to remind you how it works on this particular system.
Hi everyone, I'm Sam. I'm the comms officer at National Voices. You're probably mostly used to using Zoom and Microsoft Teams. If you haven't used WebEx before, this is a quick slide through of how it's going to work today. Just quickly before we start, we are recording this currently, and the recording will be available on YouTube on Monday. If you've got any problems with us putting this on YouTube, or if you want us to make it private, just let me know on the chat or send me an email, and we're quite happy to share this with whoever after. WebEx is very simple. There's some icons at the bottom of the screen at the moment. You can control your microphone, your video. If you could launch the chat now, that would be great, which is the speech icon, and just introduce yourself. And that is where most of the contributions will be happening today. If you have any questions or any insights, please put them on there throughout, and we'll try and answer them. Yeah, back to you, Charlotte.
Okay, so this is the agenda for today, roughly anyway. I'll do my best to keep us to time so that you're all off at midday. Some of you probably looking after children and they'll be hungry at that point, at least mine will be. So we let you go for 12. Before we kick off with our new speakers today, I'd like to recap briefly what we've done with the last few webinars, because it's always nice to sort of close the loop. Sam, if you go to the next slide. So we had last week a webinar, which was on Thursday, looking at care in the times of COVID, which was a piece of research we launched with our friends and partners at Traverse, who are a small community interest company or a social enterprise that do a lot of sort of engagement around health and care policy. And they interviewed, I think it was 10 people who had decided not to use health services or had experienced health service cancellations. And we discussed the findings from that research with Martin Marshall, who's the chair of the RCGP, with David McNally, who is the head of patient experience at NHS England. And we had really high-flying people on the webinar. We had Neil Churchill, who was obviously an executive director at NHS England, and we had Tessa Richard from the BMJ, we had Dan Wellings from the King's Fund. And so it became apparent that this is obviously really top of the agenda. How are people behaving right now towards the health system, and why are they not using services in the way they used to? And a real appetite from decision makers to understand this more deeply, and also to understand more deeply how people are experiencing new service models. So where they can't go to an outpatient appointment, or they can't go and see their GP, they might be offered a drive-through, they might be offered a phone call, they might be offered a video consultation. And they want to understand better what that's like for people, particularly those with a high disease burden of maybe low health literacy or suffering from digital exclusion and so on. So we are taking this away, and we're doing a follow-up piece of work with Traverse and with HealthWatch, which is really exciting, trying to understand how people are currently experiencing these new care models, because we're really keen that as decisions are made about these new care models, they're fully cited on the actual experience of people who use them or decide not to use them, because I think that's also really important to understand. So that's work we're kicking off quietly behind the scenes. We're interviewing people with long-term conditions who experienced cancellations. If any of you want to help field people we could speak to, please do get in touch with me or with Sam. That'll be info@nationalvoices.org.uk. We want to speak to people who've experienced delays or cancellations, essentially, and possibly new care models instead. And then the week before then, we had a really well-attended webinar, so well-attended that not everybody could join, which was a shame, but we've shared it since, and we're obviously going to do more work in this space around the Black and minority ethnic burden that seems to be very disproportionate around COVID. We have Professor Kevin Fenton join us, and Kadra, who is from Charities So Wide. And it was a really interesting, urgent debate we had. As a consequence, Professor Fenton invited me to join some round tables where he described the research that they're kicking off at Public Health England to understand the burden of disease. My takeaway from that work, which I've done since, is that it's a very limited review that Public Health England have got underway, and that the review they've got underway won't really answer the questions as to how people's lives inform this burden that seems to be disproportionately falling on BME citizens. So it doesn't look into income inequalities and all that sort of stuff, overcrowded housing, all that sort of stuff. So I think there's more work to be done and more thinking to be done. And it was great to see so many charities and colleagues engaging with us on this. And we are now really knuckling down with preparing for an inequalities-focused conference in the autumn. Again, if you want to contribute to that work, you can contact us. It's led at the moment by Jess and Rebecca, who are our head of engagement and head of policy. And we really want to make this a collaborative effort. We're going to do a digital conference, and we're probably going to spread it over a week because we've concluded it's not that much fun to sit in front of a screen all day. So as you can tell, a lot has happened on the back of these webinars we did. And that's obviously the purpose. We don't do these just to get together and drink a cup of tea and chat. We do these because it helps us focus our minds, hear where you're at, share what we all respectively between us know, and then get cracking with some action. So watch this space. God knows what we're going to do on the back of this one. And with that in mind, because Georgina has done some great work already, and she will lead on action going forward from this webinar, I hand over to Georgina, who will talk about a survey that some of you filled in, and she has looked at the data that's generated. Thank you. Over to you, Georgina.
Great. Thank you so much, Charlotte. And thank you very much for having the opportunity really to share it and for sharing the survey amongst your membership. So yeah, we launched a survey a few weeks ago now looking at what the impact has been on you in terms of COVID-19. And if we just move to the next slide, please, Sam. We got around 40 responses, which I think reflects somewhat survey fatigue. I guess there's a lot going around at the moment, but nonetheless, it's a snapshot in terms of what's going on in the sector. And you can see there that nearly 60% of respondents were from charities that had an income of less than $1 million. So we're looking at primarily kind of smaller charities that have filled it out. But again, that's quite reflective really of the Alliance membership, certainly. So yeah, a good snapshot. So if we go to the next slide. So we asked about how demand for your services has changed since the outbreak began. And we've heard a lot about this, I think, over the past few weeks. And as you can see quite plainly, that there has been obviously a significant increase in demand for services reported. So seen 56.4% of people reported a significant increase in demand, and 20.51% reported a slight increase. So demand and need is certainly going up during these very anxious times. Move on. And then you also helpfully provided some insight into what that demand was for. So a lot of increase to calls to helplines and so on. So lots of reports of at least kind of 4 times increase in calls to helplines, huge increases in web traffic, etc. And just overall a picture of greater demand for information, really, particularly at the outbreak of this crisis when there's a lot of concern about who ought to be shielding and who's not and who's clinically vulnerable and all of that. And we also have heard of some people launching emergency grant rounds as well in response to provide support to kind of beneficiaries. Move on. So at the same time as kind of demand skyrocketing, and we're seeing obviously unprecedented challenges to fundraising income as well amongst the sector. So the picture is pretty clear, I think, from this graph, in that we found that there's been, a significant chunk of people are expecting at least a 25% drop. It's above 30% reported, at least a 25% drop in their fundraising income over the next 12 months. An additional 27%, they're expecting at least a drop of 40%. And of course, a significant cohort of people that don't know yet either, because things are so volatile at the moment. So, I think it's tricky to estimate this stuff, but nonetheless, these sort of estimations are going to be used amongst in terms of kind of planning your activity and your strategy over the next 12 months. So it's absolutely having an impact on what we do and how we do it. So move on. At the same time, we know that capacity is a challenge. I've been on lots and lots of phone calls with our members who've had to take difficult decisions around furloughing staff, etc. Now, and are really looking to quite kind of precarious structures, I suppose, over the next 12 months. And there's a significant cohort really that have reported using the furlough scheme, so that just over 45% have furloughed staff, and another kind of few percent that intend to furlough staff. And of those that said that they were going to, or they have furloughed staff, it's been about half of their workforce that they've furloughed. Obviously, there is a significant chunk of people that haven't intended to furlough staff, and of course, the furloughing stuff is kind of just one way of coping with some of this. If you're experiencing increased demand for services, having less capacity to do that isn't going to help, and it's just one way in which you can respond to this crisis. And kind of additionally, I believe the Directorate of Social Change have just put out some research looking at kind of take-up of some of the major schemes amongst charities in the broadest sense. And there's been pretty good pick-up of the furlough scheme, but things like bounce-back loans, etc., haven't had a huge amount of pick-up in the sector. And there's probably some issues there about, taking on debt at a time when your income is looking so precarious. So there's certainly some challenges to be thinking about there. So move on. You also provided a lot of information about kind of specifically what activities had reduced, and you estimated on average that approximately a third of your activities were being reduced in response to COVID, and kind of typical stuff that's been paused or reduced are of course unfortunately research programs in particular. So we've seen research grant rounds that have been postponed as a result of this. And also kind of major clinical trials have also had to be paused. But lots of people also reporting that they're able to fulfill kind of obligations around salaries for researchers, that sort of thing. Of course, we've seen a huge kind of cancellation or postponement of fundraising events, be those with high value donors, etc., or some of those individual giving events as well. Significant challenges to service, health and care service improvement programs as well. Due to kind of clinical time being taken up elsewhere and just the context being really not conducive to be talking about improvement at kind of certainly at the peak of the crisis. And then, of course, a lot of change to kind of information and support provision with face-to-face peer groups obviously just not being appropriate or feasible at this time. But what we're also seeing is that as a sector, we've adapted really quickly, which is fantastic to see. So lots of people thinking about kind of providing digital support, providing online kind of fitness classes, that sort of thing, which is fantastic. But then, of course, there's a varying ability to kind of adapt to that stuff depending on how, I suppose, digitally transformed kind of charities were in terms of what infrastructure they had available to deliver some of those newer services. So it's been pretty variable, and of course, the ability to support staff through kind of a remote working and that sort of thing is also pretty variable across the sector. So move on. So that was just to whiz through some of the findings. The survey did close on Wednesday, so it's very much kind of just a snapshot. But I guess just in terms of my final thoughts when I was running through some of these themes, was that there's pretty heavy scepticism about the eligibility and transparency of the funding that has been announced by government. I think there has been a challenge in engaging with DCMS and DHSC about kind of the health and care aspects of that in particular. And of course, as you know, this is a marathon. We're looking at kind of recovery and restart plans and that sort of thing at the moment. But due to kind of the unprecedented challenges to income, etc., it's going to be, I think it's going to be slow, that recovery. And at the moment, we don't seem to have got the support required from government in order to kind of deal with that. So I think there's a real need to kind of to push on that in the next few weeks. I think there's a particular challenge within health in that you've got a very diffuse and kind of fragmented system that we're working within. And that's meant that kind of accountability of it is equally kind of diffuse. And so engaging with the kind of health bodies as appropriate, I think, is really challenging. So kind of making the case for the support that's required is just that much harder, I think. So again, how can we kind of collectively think about a good strategy to engage with that with those respective bodies? I guess overall, there's absolutely a message that we need government in order to provide kind of support for the sector, etc. But crucially, the government needs us as a sector to get through this crisis. You know, we're providing support to lots and lots of very anxious people, lots of extremely vulnerable people at the moment, and kind of income is a bit precarious. So I think we really need to get that across, that we simply won't get through this crisis without a diverse and a robust health and care voluntary sector. And I think that's a message we absolutely should be pushing with. You talked already about the work that you're doing around digital exclusion, etc. And I think that's excellent to hear about, because there's a lot of discussion about how we can lock in some of these innovative kind of solutions that have been adopted around kind of video consultations and all that sort of stuff. And there's a real need to make sure that there's a good focus on kind of how people are experiencing those services at the moment. So we really want to work with you on that, Charlotte, as well. And then, as I said before, this is really a marathon, but that's also kind of thinking about the Treasury this week looked at scenarios in which, we could be thinking about a bounce back of our economy. It started to talk about tax hikes, etc., but equally it started to talk about possible cuts to services, for example, welfare. So there's a broader conversation I think that we need to be alert to and prepare for around making sure that we learn the lessons of the past, so the cuts to vital forms of financial support, etc., to make sure that people are able to get kind of the treatment, care and support and they need, and we don't slip back to kind of austerity essentially. So, and that's something that I think we all should be working together on. So yeah, that's just a snapshot for now.
Brilliant, thank you, Georgina. So helpful. Quite a lot going on here on the chat as well. People talking about the different income strands they have and how statutory funders are behaving vis-a-vis grant funders. A big problem we've also found is, and I'm sure a lot of you, is that some grant funders are limiting their support now to people that already have existing grant relationships with, which makes it obviously hard for all of us who try to break into that market. Community fundraising being a real problem. It strikes me, like, for example, when I think about the Health and Wellbeing Alliance, where we are a member, and I'm grateful some of you have joined us today, what we always thought was a strength of the health sector, and that it sort of inspired people to give in a way that maybe less sexy causes find it hard. You know, if you work with prisoners and drug users and homeless, it's harder to fundraise than it is if you work for children with cancer in the community. That's now becoming a real Achilles heel, I think, for the charities in the health sector, and that we have a lot less income that's about service delivery that's paid for by the state. So if you work with prisoners, you're much more likely to be funded by the state, which will continue to do your work. When you think about all the helplines we provide and all the digital information, 99% of that is not funded by the state. It's funded through community fundraising. So I think it's exposed us to a real vulnerability that I think we've never really managed to land with the statutory health system, that we are a provider in this space, and we are doing we're providing frontline support to people with their questions, with their concerns in a very holistic way. And now I think it's really biting us in the bum, because now it's hard to make the argument that this should be funded, this work. But I very much take Georgina's point that we are part of a sort of landscape of health and care provision, which keeps people safe and helps them cope. Just looking at right, lots of ideas around how we could talk about the digital divide as well. Georgina, do you want to outline what we're planning to do with this? Because we are thinking about talking to the select committee about this, aren't we?
Yeah. So thank you for that. So we've so together with National Voices, Richmond Group as well, and ARMA, we're now kind of thinking about how we use some of this evidence and make the case, I guess, for additional support or a review of the support that's available specific to kind of health and care charities. And one way in which we want to do that is through submitting a response to the DCMS committee inquiry on the impact of COVID on DCMS sectors. And I know that other health coalitions are doing the same. So hopefully we've got a good piece of evidence there. I think there has been a challenge, though, also around kind of engagement with people like DHSC, et cetera, around the funding. So we're also looking at kind of pulling together briefings to try and engage with parliamentarians kind of more broadly, to try and get a few kind of pointed PQs down, that sort of thing, to basically to encourage engagement as we kind of consider the recovery plan. So it'll be really helpful as well is if there's anything specific kind of for health and care charities that would be helpful now, I suppose, as we look into recovery that isn't really outlined within kind of the current kind of broader schemes that are available in terms of support. It'd be really helpful to know about that because we can kind of weave that into our collective policy calls.
Yes, so just to sort of reiterate that, we are going to collaborate with Georgina and with the Richmond Group and with ARMA about pulling together a shared response that we will share with the Select Committee. If you have any kind of case studies or, good examples, quite apart from the sort of quantitative data that Georgina has now pulled together about how you've innovated some of your delivery to meet demand, how you maybe had to very counterproductively follow people who were exactly at the front line of delivering support to people, do contact us. It's always good to have little kind of vignettes or stuff like that in a submission to Parliament. And we will kind of try to wrap this engagement into wider sector-wide efforts, very mindful that we don't want to duplicate and we don't want to muddy the water and kind of undermine each other's messages. But I think there is an argument that we as health charities have to land a particular argument in that we are helping people cope with ill health during a period where the health system really cannot deal with more demand and more worried people washing up with questions and all the rest of it. So there is a sort of health-specific part that we will try to own, very much working as friends and comrades with people in the wider sector who are doing a much wider lobbying effort. And that segues us very nicely over to hearing from Sarah Vibert now, who can talk about what that looks like for the NCVO efforts and the programs that she was plugged into and is leading on. For those of you who don't know, the National Council of Voluntary Organisations is the umbrella body of umbrella bodies, but also all charities can join it, so not just health charities. So, the Youth Hostel Association are members, and very, very large charities, but also loads of small ones from all sectors, culture and animals and children and human rights and immigration and so on and so on, arts and heritage. And very difficult to hold the ring on all of this as we talk to government about the need to support the sector. So it'd be interesting to hear what Sarah's thinking is around all of that. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks very much, Charlotte, and hello everyone, and thank you very much for having me here today. So as Charlotte has said, I'm going to just briefly talk you through the work that NCVO has been doing with our infrastructure partners and with the sector to influence government in particular, but also other parts of the ecosystem in relation to support during the COVID-19 crisis. Could I have the next slide, please? So I'm going to talk about the campaign that we've run, and it's in two main parts really. So I'm going to start off by just talking about phase one, which really took us up to when the government announced funding for the sector. So we were first called to a meeting, NCVO and others across the sector, with the Department for Culture, Media.
You're very crackly. Sarah, you're very crackly. It's actually quite hard to hear you.
That's responsible.
Sarah, it's actually quite. Sarah, can you hear me? It's actually quite hard to hear you. I'm wondering whether it's better if you call in on the phone. Do you have the details for that? Because your Wi-Fi is, I think, too bad to talk down a camera. Do you think you could make that happen? The email that Sam sent earlier has all of call-in details. I wonder whether Sarah will do that. Sarah doesn't live in London, and it's a stark reminder that Wi-Fi is really terrible outside of it.
Sorry, everyone.
You're going to call in on the phone?
No problem.
Okay. Someone is just saying, we've put in lots of PQC, the clarity on central government funding processes.
Yeah, I'm calling now.
Okay. That's Rosie.
Yeah.
I think you're from Macmillan, aren't you, Rosie?
Yeah, that's Rosie from Macmillan.
Yeah. Oh, that will be very helpful. If you've got answers to those PQs, that would be even more helpful, but probably not yet. But it would be useful to understand what questions you've already asked, because there's no point asking the same ones. They're just going to get kicked out, aren't they? So if you could make that connection offline, that'd be great. And someone is also sharing a resource from the Media Trust about how charities can deliver digitally excellent engagement. So we will definitely look at that. Now let's hope Sarah is calling in. Sarah, can you hear us?
Charlotte, if you keep maybe discussing stuff on the chat, I'll just work with Sarah to try and get her connected.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sam, could you maybe forward to the slides about our COVID voices then, and then I talk about that whilst you get Sarah connected?
Sure.
But can I move the slides forward? I can't very easily, can I?
Let me do the slides. Hang on. Okay. Do that. There we are.
Okay. So I was planning to speak at the end of the webinar very briefly about our COVID voices. But we do it now, and then we can finish with Sarah's contribution. We launched this last week. It's now it's been live for less than 2 weeks. So it's very early days, and we have so far kind of soft launched it largely to our members. The idea is that we've created a platform. Please go and have a look. We're very proud of it, where anyone living with ongoing health and care needs can talk about their experiences right now, living through the COVID crisis. The sort of seed of an insight that informed this piece of work is that whilst we never talk more about health and health policy, we have, in a way, allowed people with ongoing health and care needs to experience a withdrawal and a reduction of services. And maybe that was entirely necessary. I'm not saying that we could have continued as normal with MS services and cancer services and arthritis services, but it's important to hold on to that insight that a lot of people with ill health are actually less well supported now than there were, and that needs to be sorted out. And in order to sort it out, we feel it's really important to understand what actually goes on for people. So we have about 20 or so contributions. Yesterday we did. It's slowly going up. From people who are describing their experiences. You can find them on this browse link there. You can tag as you search, so you can say, I want to look for shielding experiences, or I want to look for experiences to do with food or with children. And there is, Sam, if you could go forward with the slides, that would be great. And the next one, right. There is, this is one example of a story that we have received, and it's someone who describes how they lost a whole load of mental health support, and also how they had to suddenly, do tests and injections in a car, and then something about community support and how they couldn't get their hands on food and how neighbours stepped in and helped. So one thing that strikes me about the stories we've got so far is that they quite organically, and you will know that whenever you talk to people living with ill health, talk about clinical needs, but they also talk a lot about life needs and circumstances. I think all of them do that to an extent. I think all of them, the ones I've read so far, touch on mental health, which makes me really think we need to, in our attempt to rebuild the health system, foreground mental health support.
Hi, Sarah, I've got your message. Just
Sam, particularly as people will have to wait for so long now to see a practitioner about their problems, and that is not going to change anytime soon, we think. We have quite a lot of stories from people who are shielding, so we think that's another really good insight into people's experiences. We are working with NHS England on some of that stuff. What are the clinical support needs for people who are shielding, but also what are their wider social, holistic, emotional support needs, financial. And one thing that Rebecca and I, Rebecca is also on the call, our new head of policy, have started thinking about a lot is what does it look like when we start lifting restrictions around leaving the house and going to work? And are we at risk of creating an even more divided society where the people with ongoing health problems and disabilities are left behind even more, because the rest of us go back to work possibly and go back to commuting and so on, and we might exacerbate existing inequalities, which is obviously the last thing we can let happen. So we are thinking about how we can take this insight to those decisions about how we need to come out of lockdown. And Rebecca and I are having conversations how we will take this to the media and how we can generate insight from the stories people are uploading. Sam, you've somehow taken the slides away.
I'm having to share a meeting ID with Sarah. Sorry, just give me two.
Oh, okay. So before I finish this part of the meeting, I just want to ask you, please do share this link with the people you are supporting. We need many, many more stories to make this a credible source of insight and influence. You are the ones who are in touch with those people. So if you work for a large organization, please do go and talk to your participation team, your volunteering team, your information and support teams, and see whether they can get this in front of people. And if you work for a small organization, you probably work with people yourselves who have health and care needs. And we need you to share this opportunity with them. We can support people who find it hard or don't want to write. We're working with a furloughed filmmaker who's made some really beautiful little films, which we can share later as well, about various people who prefer to speak to camera. We also work with a furloughed writer who is happy to interview someone and then write a story about what they've said. So we want to make this, we have a few stories already from people who live with learning disabilities who needed help to write their stories. So we want to make this really inclusive and really provide all sorts of varied access to it. So don't hold back, put people forward, tell them about this opportunity, and we will hopefully achieve a very large number of submissions on here. Right, I'm now turning to Sam. Hopefully we have got this sorted. Still faffing around.
Still having some technical difficulties. Could you open up to the floor and maybe have a general discussion with the comments? I'll try and get Sarah on as soon as I can.
Okay. It's been working so well so far. We've not had any technical difficulties, I don't think, on any of our webinars, so I don't know why it's so difficult today.
Charlotte?
Yeah?
I've turned my video off. Can you hear me better? Can you hear me better now I've turned my video off? Shall I just start? And if the problem is we need an extra ID code to dial in, so I just can't get in. Shall I just start and tell me if you can't hear me?
Okay, wonderful.
Okay.
Right. So Sarah, you talked out where you talked about phase 1 of influencing.
Okay, cool. Just slide please. Okay, sorry everyone. Yes, I don't live in the middle of nowhere, I just don't live in London. Anyway, so we were first called to a meeting with the Department for Culture, Media and Sport on the 13th of March, which seems a very long time ago now. And at that meeting, we were asked to start to talk about what we thought the impact on the sector would be of social distancing as a result of COVID. And so our first port of call with this campaign was very much around providing the data to the government. It was surprising how little knowledge they had of the charity sector in terms of where our funding comes from, how funding would likely be impacted by social distancing. investments, the level of reserves we have, the types of charities that sit across the sector, say, for example, who furloughing might or might not work for. And we estimated a £4 billion funding gap over the 3 months to the middle of June. That was probably an underestimate. But if you think about the net loss to the sector, given the funding people have been able to bring in through the furlough scheme, it maybe was about right for a net loss, but we're going to be revising that soon anyway. We had 2 main calls in phase 1 of the campaign. One was that we needed a mobilisation fund, which was very much around bringing in emergency funding to support the increased demand. But in parallel, also a stabilisation fund, which was about all charities that were having their fundraising and trading income hit as a result of social distancing. So the campaign that we ran started off very much around private influencing, and we then moved quite quickly to a much more broader public affairs campaign, raising parliamentary questions, raising the issues in the Lords, giving evidence to the Department for Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee. We gained really good cross-party support. We even briefed the Queen about the issues. It grew into a PR campaign and a social media campaign, and I'm sure some of you have seen the hashtag #EverydayCounts, which was the hashtag we were using for the first part of the campaign. So as I said, this part of the campaign really ended on the 8th of April when we got the announcement of the £750 million funding. Could I have the next slide, please? So I won't talk in too much detail to this slide because I'm aware we pushed the time and you probably know quite a lot of this, so I'm happy to answer questions. But roughly speaking, the funding package that was agreed was in 3 parts. There was £360 million, which would be distributed centrally. The government were very clear this was not a bailout. This was about increased demand on charities, but it was new money. Departments were asked to bid in centrally to the Treasury for funding, and it's probably fair to say that most of that funding is now allocated, and I'll come back to the lack of transparency and some of the issues that Georgina touched on in a minute. The second part of this funding was the £370 million for smaller charities, which will be distributed via the lottery. Again, I'll come back to this in terms of the delays here, but we do know that these grants are likely to be mostly, but not exclusively, for charities with income of under £1 million, and the grants will mostly, but again, not all, be under £100,000 in value. And we think that the priority will be very much around organisations that are directly working on a response to COVID. So yeah, more should emerge next week in terms of the lottery funding, but we have been told that every week for the last few weeks. So there's certainly delays in this area. And then the third part of the government announced funding was around a matched fund for the Big Night In, which took place a few weeks ago. And that's already started going out to organisations. It's aimed at very small, very local community organisations, and it's being distributed via the network of community foundations. And these grants are all very small and, you know, always under probably about £1,000. Not most of them are about under £1,000, a few maybe slightly more than that. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a bit more detail about phase 2 of the campaign, because that's really where we are now, and everything I've said up to now is stuff that's kind of already happened, I guess. So in terms of phase 2 of the campaign, we have 3 main objectives, which I'll talk through over the next 3 slides and then move to questions. And when I say we, these are campaigning priorities that we've agreed across the infrastructure bodies, which I'm sure those of you who work in policy can imagine that is no mean feat to get all those different organisations to sign up to the same policy calls. So the first call is very much about the immediacy of ensuring that the distribution of the funding that's been made available by government is distributed in a way that is quick, that is efficient, and that has human rights designed from the outset in terms of meeting people's needs and also around transparent decision making. So we've done a lot of work around equity and developing equitable principles for funding distribution. And we've also tried to make these quite future looking. We're well aware that there's parts of the sector that historically have been underfunded, and looking at how we can kind of put right some of that balance. And so with this work, we're seeking to influence the government, but also funders beyond the government and lottery in terms of the wider funding environment. On Wednesday, NCVO and others came out a lot more strongly in criticising the government about the way in which the funding has been distributed, or rather hasn't been distributed. So it's more than a month now since the funding was announced, and very little, as far as we know, has flowed actually to organisations. And as I mentioned already, the lottery is not yet open for applications. I think it's important to say it's not the lottery's fault. I think a lot of the delays are on the government side, but we are getting very frustrated, I think, now with the delays. And then I think the other thing that Georgina touched upon is the lack of transparency. And so we know that some charities were asked by government departments to bid for funding, whereas others heard absolutely nothing. And all the departments seem to have used different processes, which does nothing for my first point around kind of equity. And we've had several more announcements in the last few weeks about other smaller pots of funding. And each time it's not been clear if this is new money or if it's part of the original 750 million that they pledged. Could I have the next slide, please? So the second kind of area that we've been working on is around influencing to make the necessary regulatory changes to the existing financial support measures that were, let's face it, drawn up with business in mind to try and make them more fit for purpose for charities and voluntary organisations. So I suppose the big focus, and again, this touches on the findings of the survey that Georgina talked about, is how can we make the furlough scheme work better for charities? I think we've been very clear all along that if you're a pub, you can mothball the kegs, you can close up for a few months. If you're a charity, you need to do absolutely the opposite. You need to mobilise, and you know we're needed now more than ever. And I haven't included it in the slide, so the hashtag that we're using for the second part of the campaign has been never more needed, to really try and underline that point that charities cannot be reducing their support. That said, we know that charities are making good use of the furlough scheme, probably because it's kind of one of the only things that works for them to any extent. And so given the scheme has now been extended, and we're writing to the Chancellor on Monday at the infrastructure bodies with a number of calls around how we think the furlough scheme could be improved. And top of the list in terms of those calls for action is that people from charities who are furloughed should be allowed to volunteer back for the organisation they work for, albeit in a different role, so a voluntary role. And we think that's really important in terms of charities being able to meet the growing demand. We're also very concerned about the end of the scheme, because I think some aspects of what charities do around trading, around fundraising, is probably going to take a lot longer to come back, or certainly to come back to pre-crisis levels. And so we're quite concerned that if the scheme just suddenly ends, that will have quite a catastrophic effect on charity income. So as I said, we're writing to the Chancellor on Monday about all of that with a kind of joint letter across the infrastructure bodies. Yes, then there's been a few other things that we have had limited success on in terms of changes to other schemes, but we are aware from kind of surveys like the one Georgina just highlighted that these are not being used as well by charities, and it's because they're not really as suitable. So there have been some changes to the loan schemes so that charities are now eligible, but I think it's a very difficult decision for a Board of Trustees to decide to take on debt at this time. There's also been some changes to the grants that are distributed by local authorities, the small business grant scheme, which now explicitly include charities, which they didn't before. So, you know, you have to take your wins where you can get them in policy, but I think we all realise that the big win would be changes to the furlough scheme. Can we move to the next slide, please? And then the third, I suppose, bigger policy ask, and this isn't to some extent the hardest one really, is around the medium and long-term scale of the challenge that the sector is going to face as a result of social distancing and COVID. And so when the funding was first announced, the 750 million, NCVO had a really tricky balance to strike. You know, we couldn't just, you know, say this is not enough and kind of, you know, not welcome the funding. And we had to welcome the funding. But we also had to find a way to acknowledge that there was a lot more to do, and the government couldn't think that was the job done. So my clever comms team came up with the phrase, "It's an important start," which I think is the line that we've continued to give when asked about the funding. But we're very clear as NCVO, and I think as the other infrastructure bodies, that there is a lot more to do. And if charities are going to play a longer term role in rebuilding and recovery, there's going to need to be some resources for that. So we're very much into kind of evidence-based kind of policy influencing. So the priority for me and my team at the moment is how do we evidence the impact on charities, the evidence, the impact on their services, on their governance, and critically on their finance. So once all this funding has been allocated and all the funding, the public fundraising that's been done, and the way in which kind of trusts and foundations have pivoted their work, what are the gaps? You know, and how much have charities benefit from the furlough scheme, and which parts of the sector are still really struggling? You know, we realised during an earlier part of the campaign really that talking to government about charities just doesn't work. They care about subsectors, and so I think it's really important for us as NCVO now to be able to talk about how we break down the charity sector into the subsectors that perhaps make more sense to government. So really keen to work with National Voices and Neurological Alliance and others on the impact on health-related charities, because that's a very specific part of the charity sector with a very specific role to play in society. We are starting to think about the medium and longer term. We've done a very quick piece of research this week on easing the restrictions and the lifting of lockdown and what the implications are for charities. In terms of policy, there's clearly a lot of work to do around the furlough scheme there, but actually what NCVO is doing is developing a lot of practical resources, and there'll be all sorts of webinars and things coming out over the next few months around what lifting the lockdown means for charities. And I should say at this point that we've lifted our paywall on almost everything we're doing, like Charlotte, so to try and be really kind of generous leaders in this crisis. And so if you're not members, you should still be able to access a lot of that. And then finally, I think we're starting to think about the role of the sector in the longer term and what our ask is to government here. Government have been quite clear there's no more emergency funding for the sector, but I think where we may have some room to influence is in how the sector plays a role in recovery and rebuilding. And I think a lot of that's about how we shift our relationship with government, how we put equity and inclusion at the heart of the work we're doing, how we show the value of social infrastructure. And so we're going to be spending a lot of time really on how we make the case to government for this. So I'll end there. It's probably worth saying I won't have all the answers, especially on the technical detail of different schemes. I would have to defer to members of my team on that, but I'm really interested to hear your questions and reflections on what I've said.
That's great. Thank you, Sarah. So much ground covered in such a short period of time. Breathe now. And you were really clear, so it did work to take the video off. So thank you for that. Right. We had a question about the wider impact of the economic downturn, which is obviously twofold, isn't it? In that funding will dry up, you know, over the course of the next few years, or will be hard to come by anyway, if companies downsize, if local authorities run out of dosh, if governments start austerity, but also need will increase. And you said you have started doing a little bit of modeling around lockdown restrictions. Have you started thinking about the sort of medium-term future of the sector in a society that will be considerably in debt?
Yeah, very much so, and starting to think about scenarios for the future for the sector, and starting to, everybody has kind of rushed to do research, I think, on the impact on the sector, and it's kind of how we bring all of those pieces of research together. And I think it's a really interesting piece of work to do, to look at, you know, what's the totality of that, and, you know, how do the wider economic factors play into that. So certainly something that my research team is starting to look at, but something that we can't do on our own. You know, it's very much about a network across the sector in terms of how we build that. But yeah, we don't have an answer yet.
And the stuff you mentioned, that the team has done a quick piece of research on what it looks like now with lockdown restrictions easing. Can you say a little bit about what they found?
What we've done on that, so we're still actually gathering data on that. So if you wanted to answer our very short questionnaire, it's on our website. It's just a very short form to fill in on what you think the implications will be for you. The reason we did it is we wanted to know, are there very specific things about the charity sector that need to be fed into government discussions about lifting the lockdown? And I think we've concluded that the only very specific thing is, as far as we can see at the moment, is the fact that fundraising and trading in the charity sector are probably going to take a lot longer to get back to normal. And so we're very clear that if the furlough scheme suddenly ends in October, for want of a a date to pick, that could have a catastrophic impact on charities. And so we're very much focusing our policy effort on that. In terms of the kind of what have we found and what are we doing with it, most of it we're going to use to inform the practical support that we provide for the sector over the next few months. So webinars, Q&A documents, checklists around, really practical stuff. Sorry, did I cut out?
No, that was all right. Thank you. So one thing that strikes me, and I wonder whether people on the webinar have got any thoughts on that, is the people we support are much more likely than the general population to be shielding, to be asked to strictly self-isolate, to be much more vulnerable towards the virus, and whether that poses a particular problematic for health charities in that they, in their fundraising models and their service delivery models, that they are facing the biggest challenge in a way to get to people who are told to shield and not leave the house and so on. I don't know whether any of the people on this call might have started thinking about that. How do we keep people engaged and supported, and also how do we keep fundraising with and through them if they are much more likely to be in that group of people who can't leave the house? So someone's saying a specific challenge is how people are giving at the moment. A lot are going through NHS charities. Yes, I mean, that is, it's always tricky to kind of divide and rule in the sector, but you do have to wonder what could have been achieved if £30 million had gone to small and medium-sized health charities rather than NHS charities. But yes, problematic.
Charlotte, I think there's also a specific thing around, as you say, about people who are shielding in relation to volunteering. So, for example, charity shops reopening is going to be a huge issue because of the demographic of charity sector volunteers, and that a lot of them will be continuing to shield and won't be going back to volunteer in charity shops. So we're doing some quite interesting work across the volunteering infrastructure to look at, for example, how can we encourage more young people to volunteer in the short term, and how can we kind of backfill some of those roles, but also how can we create roles that people can do from home and can volunteer and can do kind of meaningful things during this time.
Yeah, really interesting point, actually. I mean, I'm just reading properly the point Georgina made about NHS charities and wider NHS funding, and how do we kind of carve out a space for charities that aren't NHS charities in this, that kind of rides the wave of goodwill towards the health and care sector, but kind of says, we provide helplines, we support people with their everyday living concerns. It's a difficult communications challenge, but maybe something we can together do a bit of thinking on. Any other thoughts from anyone right now? Elizabeth Racker was trying to say something but can't unmute. Maybe you could say it. Oh, are you there? No? Okay. Well, really interesting. Sarah, is there anything else you want to say before we conclude? Anything you want us to do as National Voices or our members? You've already mentioned a questionnaire on a quick survey on your website that people can fill in that explores any dynamics around lockdown. But is there anything else from your end?
I think the only last thing I'd just say is it's been fantastic to work with National Voices and lots of the other infrastructure bodies and subsector bodies in a way I don't think we've ever done before, Charlotte. I'm sure you'll agree. I mean, we're having weekly calls with kind of 30 chief execs, including Georgina, including Charlotte, including lots of others. And I feel like it's a really positive thing for the sector. And I really want to keep those conversations going and kind of think about how we sustain that into the longer term and make that a kind of normal way for the sector to work. Because I think too often we all just work in our little bubbles, don't we?
Absolutely, and it's been a really, it's been a very marked culture change, I think, with new people in leadership positions at NCVO and NCVO and elsewhere. That we're all natural collaborators, and it's just brilliant to see that come to fruition. On that note, I might just, if you'll indulge me for a second, say we're all membership organisations, and a big chunk of our income comes from our membership, and we're also small organisations. So if any of you on this call aren't members of National Voices or aren't members of the NCVO or are neurological charities and aren't members of the Neurological Alliance, please do consider joining these infrastructure organisations. I think one thing that this crisis has really shown is that the sector cannot, the thousands and thousands of charities, speak to decision makers at a senior level without the help of these infrastructure bodies. And, we don't want to wake up in 2 or 3 years' time and all of us have gone bust. So please don't stop being members of us. And if you are not already members, consider joining. I know for National Voices, joining National Voices is very cheap if you're small and virtually free. It's free for very small organizations. So, we're trying to serve you during this crisis with all this engagement work and information and weekly newsletters and weekly webinars. It would be great if you could stay engaged with all these efforts and support us by remaining members or becoming members. Right, I'll shut up at this point. We have shared with you some opportunities to get involved with National Voices work. Some of you have said you're going to talk to Georgina about the contribution to the Select Committee. Sarah's asked you to fill in a questionnaire if you have a moment about how your charity might be impacted by the easing of lockdown. So there's plenty to get on with. We have our work cut out, that's for sure. And I'll see you all next week when we will be talking about food security, which is fascinating. And we have Freddie speaking from the MS Society, who leads some sector-wide engagement with the food industry, and DEFRA, and we've got some representatives from the food industry to join us to talk about how can we get food security right for people throughout this crisis, which is an issue that was generated by you telling us that this is something that comes up on your helpline still massively. So I see you all next week. Have a good weekend and stay well and stay engaged. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Charlotte.
Thank you.